Black is beautiful. Yes, it is. Black is beautiful.
No justice, no peace. I'm Alana.
I'm Kalia.
And I'm Donnie.
And welcome to The Take. Today we're going to be continuing the conversation we had last week regarding the relationship between the police and the Black community, as well as the lack of Black history education and police training. We have guests on both sides of the mic today. We will introduce them in a second. Throughout our series, we have had a focus on our resolution in Black history. Today we want to provide a space where we can discuss the SROs in our public schools, have a dialogue about the relationship with police departments and people of color in our community as a whole. We would also like to discuss why people of color continue to be the target of escalated police responses, what the police department is doing to ensure the encounters between police officers and people of color are specifically more fair and safe. And we would also like the police department to consider deeper training on Black history in both the academy and a part of regular and ongoing training.
We know that when it comes to Black lives and the police, it can feel like or be a life or death situation. We want to change that. We know that police violence is more common against Black people, and we want it to stop. We want to explore possible solutions on what can be done in order to hopefully have our brothers and sisters feel safe and be safe in their country. This is our space where we can create dialogue about history, policies, and protocols that negatively affect Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. A safe place to agree or disagree and learn to understand.
Today's episode is Black Meets Blue. In this episode, we will address the concerns just mentioned and discuss how they can begin to be changed. We have a great group today.
We also have Mr. Maxey and Mr. Murdoch from our student culture team at DMLK who will be helping us host this special episode.
Welcome and thank you for joining us on The Take today. Before we get started, we have to remind our listeners about our trigger alert. Donnie, can you please read the trigger alert?
If you are not 110% in support of Black Lives Matter, please dismiss yourself. If you are in any sort of agreement with the systematic oppressions this country has inflicted on minorities, once again, please dismiss yourself. And if you are not willing to give every bit of the power that the people so undeniably deserve, then please dismiss yourself. Because in a few moments, you'll witness vast amounts of Black engagement. And if you do not dismiss yourself, then the thoughts, facts, and feelings we're about to share will most definitely dismiss you. So, Chief Wilson, thank you for being here with us today. We know a little bit about the work you've been doing in Aurora, but can you please tell us more about some of the history you have within your community and how you are using those experiences to benefit communities like ours?
Thank you so much for having me. So I've been in policing for 27 years, and 25 of those years have been with the Aurora Police Department and serving the community of Aurora. I joined policing not always wanting to be a police officer. I joined policing wanting to be a part of the change. I was in college and I saw how it was sort of an us versus them mentality. And obviously across the nation, we still see that, but I felt I could make a better change by being in the inside fighting than being from the outside fighting. And so I decided to become a police officer. And when I joined the force, I had all these preconceived notions of what type of people I would be working with. And not to say that I didn't experience some bigots and sexists in my experiences in the last 27 years, because I have. But I also saw a lot of people that really were doing the job because they cared about the community and they really, truly wanted to help people. And so I felt as though we could build on that. Since I moved up the ranks, I felt it was important to make sure that we were reaching out to some of our marginalized communities, especially I'd worked on some programs with the homelessness issue, people experiencing homelessness, and developed a program with the city here, as well as brought the crisis response team, which is mental health clinicians partnered with an officer to respond to mental health crises, because we don't want to criminalize homelessness or mental illness. And so we need to make sure that we're working with these communities. So I just really try to focus on collaboration and communication and looking where change needs to happen. And so that's why I'm just very thankful to be invited to listen and to learn from you all today. I would just, I'm excited about being here today to learn and to listen to all of you and to your frustrations, some of your solutions and some of your passions, and for us to have a really good conversation. So thank you for having me.
Of course, thank you for being here. Thank you so much for all that information. In addition to our trigger alert, we also want to name that conversations like these are hard to have, but they are also very important. It's not our intent to accuse or blame anyone or make them feel like they're being forced into opposition. We ask serious questions because we discuss serious topics.
And just to get into our first question, DPS has recently taken SROs out of schools. However, we understand that APS has chosen to keep theirs. How is having police officers in schools bridging the gap between police and the communities in your school?
I think, first of all, there are many people, and not all people, because I know this is a conversation that there's differing opinions on. Not all people want officers in schools, and I understand that. I can tell you that a lot of teachers and, Superintendent Rico Munn of APS wants to keep SROs within the school. And I think it gives us an opportunity to get to know one another. It gives us an opportunity to communicate with each other and to try and understand one another better, as well as the safety feature. We've seen way too many tragedies where young youth have been killed across the nation. And so I think with teachers and some students, they feel a little sense of relief knowing that there's officers there. But I also know there's the opposite side of that. And so what I need to do is to make sure that the officers that I put in the schools have the right mindset and have the right personalities to be there.
Yes, thank you for saying that. And yes, there has been many tragedies, unfortunately, but with our podcast, it was birthed after the death of George Floyd, and we knew that we had to use our voice in order to basically commence change. And there's an extensive list of people who have innocently died at the hands of police brutality, such as Breonna Taylor, Daniel Prude, Rayshard Brooks, Tatiana Jefferson, Stephon Clark, and so many more. And this has to stop, and we want to work together to ensure that it does. Why do you think this relationship has been so toxic, and what changes are being made on your end to help avoid future incidents like the ones that have taken so many innocent people's lives?
So I would be remiss before I go on to add a name to your list, and that name is Elijah McClain, and the tragedy of Elijah and his interactions with the Aurora police and Aurora fire. And so it was important to me to look at when you asked about, I think the question was, what has made this relationship so toxic? I think it's history, the history of policing, starting with, the slave patrols and this, that, and the other thing. And then also not having education about that. A lot of officers don't even know that is part of what was going on in many states, especially in the South. And that is what, that historical trauma that exists from that history. And then, of course, through segregation and all the protests and the Martin Luther King movement and how people were treated as they were just trying to get basic human rights. And so I feel as though that's the history of where we're at. And then, of course, the tragic deaths across the nation that we've seen. This has brought it to the forefront. This is a revolution. And I think you all are a part of that revolution. And so I believe police need to evolve. And so I'm looking at anything I can do to make it better and for officers to understand what it feels like to be a person of color and to be policed as a person of color in Aurora. And so I have asked, a mom reached out to me right after George Floyd. She told me she was afraid for her son to even walk to his job. And so her and I had a long conversation. And I asked her if she would be willing to come and talk to my new police recruits. Because, as you know, our police department does not reflect the diversity within our community. And so a lot of these officers are Caucasian, 21 years old, have never even been around or been exposed to different ethnicities, different backgrounds. And so I wanted this group of individuals, African-American individual residents, to come in and talk about what it's like to be pulled over in the city of Aurora. Because I think sometimes we can say, oh, this doesn't happen here. This isn't a problem here. This is a problem in this city or Chicago or Baltimore, you name it, where we've had many tragedies, including here. And I wanted them to look into each other's eyes and actually have a conversation about this is reality. This isn't perception. This is a reality that people of color are living. And so I want to just, bring realistic scenario-based training forefront, because normally when I went through years ago, when I went through the academy, it was, you would go through the scenario and ask someone to do something and they just immediately do it. And it didn't have the historical trauma of someone reacting and being pulled over. It didn't have whatever previous interactions they had had with law enforcement. It didn't have the fear involved. And so I think it was shocking. It can be shocking to some officers to see that real human response to interactions with us. And so that's just one of the many things. I could talk for hours about this, but I won't keep going on here.
I'm actually really, really glad you brought up Elijah McClain. I know we want to talk about that. And it's kind of public knowledge at this point that Elijah McClain's life was taken at the hands of the Aurora Police Department in 2019. And we're also just really glad that you know a bit of Black history, which is something that's just so important when it comes to Black history training and policing. And I just want to ask you, going off of that, coming into your position after his death with the public eye already in the department's direction, what were some of the first things you did in order to address the concerns of police brutality?
So one of the first things that was alarming to me was the call for service. And I can't go into a lot of details because there is a grand jury. So I'm not putting you off. I'm trying to be 100% real with you, but there is a grand jury. So I can't talk about specifics of the case. But the call of Elijah came in as a suspicious person, as you may or may not know. And the caller called in and said that he was looking sketchy. I can give you that much information because it's out there. So I thought to myself, we have to look as not only in the police department as a community about implicit bias and why people are considered suspicious, quote unquote suspicious. And it can't be about the color of their skin. It can't be about the fashion that they're wearing, whether they're in a hoodie or they're sagging jeans or what have you. That should not make someone suspicious. Something should make someone suspicious is their actions, not the way they appear. And so I changed the directive to make it so a suspicious person's call. We trained officers for many, many years where you get a call for service, you go to that address, you look for that person that's described in that call, and you make contact. So I need to break that barrier up. I need to break that cycle up, I should say, because perhaps this person isn't suspicious at all. And I want to give my officer the ability to stop, watch for themselves, not feel like they have to have that robotic response where they just go right in and start talking to an individual, but sit back and watch and make that decision from themselves. What are their actions? What are they doing? Are they just walking home from a convenience store? And if they don't find there's anything that's suspicious, let's say they're about to commit a crime or they've just been involved in a crime, then to choose not to even have that negative interaction. When I was on patrol, we'd have kids called into a neighborhood saying there's 3 Hispanic kids walking down my neighborhood with black backpacks. Okay, but what are they doing? If they're just walking down your neighborhood, you're calling because you think they don't quote unquote belong there, or perhaps that caller's implicit bias is being impacted. So I think, we need to make sure that these interactions don't happen, that those kids aren't stopped walking through that neighborhood, that we don't cause that stereotype to continue of officers just selecting that individual because of their race. And also have the conversation that a lot of times contacts come from the community and from their own implicit bias when they call in, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. And I'm thankful that you realize that that was what needed to be done and that you took steps to change what's happening in our society so that we can have a better society in the future. And I appreciate that you came from the perspective of we need to change what a suspicious looking person looks like, because you're right. And most of the time people are called as suspicious because they're Black. And I just really appreciate that that's the angle that you're coming from. But we know that positive intentions lead to positive relationships and positive outcomes. I have a few questions about building relationships with the community. Questions like, are officers trained about the communities that they serve? Are officers introduced to community leaders and key figures in the neighborhood? Do they know how the community feels about their presence and why? And are efforts being made to bring awareness to how officers' own biases shape how they view the people they are supposed to protect and serve? They're also in the chat.
Okay, so what we do now is that when we have the recruits come into the academy, a lot of times I said they haven't had much exposure to many different groups. And so we actually bring in groups to talk to the officers. They actually go out into the community, whether it's to go serve lunch at the day resource center, or do something to interact with people that are experiencing homelessness, and realize, that these are human beings. Just as we're human beings wearing a uniform, these are human beings that are at the lowest low of their life, not having a roof over their head, or dealing with drug, alcohol addiction, or mental, living with mental illness. And so that doesn't mean they're less of a person. And so we need to be able to build that relationship and understand, and just have communication and laugh with them, break bread with them. And so we really want to expose our officers to different groups. Also, we're trying to build with YASPA to have many ideas. I want a lot of different people to come in and talk to our recruiting unit, and also talk to the AAPI community, the Hispanic community, because if you don't understand people's cultures, if you don't understand where they're coming from, especially with a huge immigrant and refugee community, the fears that they may have with policing. African-American community has their historical trauma, but a lot of these individuals coming from other countries where we're very militaristic police would just shoot people on sight. And so there's a lot of fear. And then, of course, we can't ignore the fact that we have immigration. In the last 4 years of the push to ask for documentation for people, and the fear that through the Hispanic community, failing to, wanting to report a crime, or even being afraid to go to school, that was something that we needed to break down and have those communications. So we try to go out to the community. Obviously, during COVID, a lot of the festivals, all the church groups, a lot of the picnic barbecue type stuff that would happen, we weren't invited to due to the COVID restrictions. But I'm hoping that we can get back to doing that. We go monthly and meet with the NAACP and the NAACP youth, and we're trying to. I've created a community relations unit, and I brought in a civilian, a woman of color. She identifies as Chicano and Asian, and she is my civilian lens, because, as progressive as I want to be, I still have been a cop for 27 years. And so I need someone from the outside to say, this is how a civilian sees the policies and procedures you're putting in place. This is how it feels to be a woman of color in the city of Aurora. And so she has many, many contacts. And so she's constantly trying to create opportunities to learn. And she's also a DEI instructor. So she is going to be teaching. She has already taught one class to my command staff. We brought in Dr. Nita Mosby Tyler, who came in and did a course. And I've also asked that for any promotional exams, Dr. Brenda J. Allen, who used to be the Vice Chancellor of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, she wrote a book called Difference Matters. And so I've made that book be part of our reading materials for testing and promotion, so that, I'm going to bring the information to my officers and pray that they accept it. And some will eat it up. Some may be resistant, but those people will eventually be weeded out of the organization, because there's not going to be a place for any sort of bias as long as I'm here. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to educate people so that they understand. The first part is recognizing your bias, and you have to be open-minded to do so.
I don't even know what to say. I love that so much, because something that we talk about a lot is that in a system that wants change, and just in general in a society that wants change, we can't tolerate intolerance. So I'm just really glad that you're taking that approach. And I actually know, before you talked a little bit about the history of Black people within police, including slave catching, and obviously we know that you know a little bit about it, but would you say that the police who are actually in the field interacting with people are aware of this relationship, and how it can almost directly reflect the relationship between slave catchers and freed slaves in a way that's oppressive? And if they do, knowing that it's received this way, what do you think can be done to improve this aspect of our relationship?
So I think bringing the knowledge forward, and not just doing a one and done, but talking about it constantly. There's a difference between equality. There's a difference between equity, right? And so we need to continue to talk about the conversation, and we need to check in and make sure that we're understanding the conversation and put it in a safe space. And I'm not going to sit here. If you Google, the first time I did DEI training, there were some knuckleheads that resisted it and were angry. And I said, I'm sorry you didn't like it, but it's going to continue, and I'm going to keep bringing it back. So if you want to be employed here, we're going to talk about our differences, and not just African-American community, like I said, but LGBTQ plus community, the Asian AAPI community, the Hispanic community. We're going to talk about all of our differences because our differences are our strengths. But I think, what I'm trying to focus on is because an arrest is not just emotional for the person that is being contacted by the police, it's also emotional for us, especially if you're in a situation where you end up in a struggle. And so another directive that I put in place was called the Officer Relief Directive. And that also came out of the Elijah case. Whereas after you've had a struggle with an individual, you're ramped up, your emotions are high. And I need to remove that individual that is having an emotional response, adrenaline's pumping through them, remove that individual and replace them with someone with a cooler head, with someone that wasn't just in a struggle, with someone that may not have tunnel vision and can see things differently. And so now we have a directive that says if you're involved in a struggle and officers arrive on scene to help, they'll tap you out. It's what we call it, touch you on the shoulder and say, I got this. And you remove that person, not that they're planning on doing anything wrong or they're wanting to do any hurt anyone or anything of that nature, but it allows them to de-escalate the situation. Because if we keep going at it 100%, it's just going to escalate. It's just going to get higher and higher. And then you lose focus. As I know, if you've ever been scared, you focus in on something and you're not focused on everything around you, or maybe realizing that the situation in front of you is changing. And so I put that directive in. And so really focusing on de-escalation, taking our time, having realistic, like I said, scenario-based training where people aren't just compliant all the time, because people are going to be angry. This is the worst day of your life that you're contacting them. They're going to scream, they're going to yell, they're going to rant and rave. But we can teach officers that as long as you can see their hands, as long as they're not approaching you or running at you or something of that nature, take the time, if you can safely, to de-escalate the situation. And there's nothing wrong with actually backing up and not standing your ground. If you need to back up to calm things down, then do so. And so we're trying to look at all those different things that we can do. Another thing that that I really am excited about is a pilot program called the RAP system. There's something out there called the BOLO RAP. That's not what I'm talking about. It's RAP, WRAP. And that is something that I'm hoping to get rid of the hobble that we use. So I'm doing a pilot program right now. And so as you know, the hobble, people call it hog tie. And I think it's a dehumanizing type tool. And I was like, well, if there's something better out there, let's bring it to the city of Aurora. Let's not have money be the barrier to that. So the wrap is almost like a human burrito. It sits the person up, sitting up. It's like their legs are straight and they're sitting where they can breathe better. And so they're not face down. And so we don't have the dangers of positional asphyxia. The officers really like it. I'm hoping to expand it to all officers to have one. At this point, we still have the hobble in use. It's still authorized, but I'm hoping, and I think a lot of the officers are hoping that we get enough that we don't have to use that tool any longer.
I want to thank you so much for saying all that. And it's really important that the policies that you set for your department, that you're saying that you have to have this and you have to know this before you could even move forward. And that's terrific because you don't see a lot of departments doing that. And unfortunately, like you said earlier, there are multiple people of darker skin tones who are afraid of. And like many of my classmates, my response when I see a police officer is kind of filled with anxiety and fear. And as the chief of police, how do you feel knowing that many youth in our community fear interactions with the police? And why do you think that is? And how do you think we can work towards changing the stigma around fearing police interaction when you are a person of color?
First of all, it breaks my heart. It broke my heart to hear, the stories of the residents that came and reached out to me and said, this is their reality. And, we can't ignore reality anymore. And so, what I've created since I was named the police chief is called the Chief's Youth Advisory Team. And it has students from Aurora Public Schools as well as Cherry Creek Schools. Right now I have about 12 kids. We meet with them monthly. I'm actually meeting with them tonight. And we talk about issues. We talk about how do you feel about SROs in school. I actually brought a representative from APS to talk about that. And I need to know as a chief and as a 50-some-year-old woman, what it's like, white woman at that, what it's like to be, to experience that, especially as a youth, what it's like to live what you guys have lived this last year. and to see the great changes that are happening, but also the tragedies that are happening, and just the stark reality of where we are in America and where we are in our relationship with policing. And so we have really, there's no questions, off the table, kind of like with you all. And we have these conversations every month. This will be our 4th month, I believe, that we're doing it. But they are working on, we had something called a Know Your Rights booklet, which I love, the No Justice, No Peace, but to know what your rights are if you're pulled over by a police officer. And so that when someone says, show me this or do that, you can say, actually, officer, that's not what I have to do. These are my rights. And so I think education is key. And so they're like, the booklet's great, chief, but nobody's reading the booklet. But so they're working on TikTok videos, and they're working on different things to put out to educate, and maybe even on their own podcast type thing, which is awesome, to kind of get those interactions. And hopefully I can, be a part of that discussions and other officers within my agency.
Hey, Chief, how you doing? I'm Mr. Maxey. I am the middle school, high school restorative practice coordinator. Definitely enjoying the ideas and thought process that you're sharing with us and the No Justice, No Peace podcast. I greatly appreciate it. And I also want to know how you feel about people of color widely feeling that they're often treated unfairly and sometimes targeted by police, which causes some anxiety. Which causes their anxiety to elevate. And I know that you've been saying that you did some de-escalation trainings and things of that nature, which is very, very awesome. But I also would like to hear a little bit further on what you on the training in regards to specifically the intent of training around working with people of color, and how that, and also not just people of color, but also people with mental health concerns.
So we have revamped the training academy to go from this warrior mentality, and the warrior garden thing's thrown around a lot. So really what I like to say is from the us versus them mentality to the I work for you mentality, right? I am a public servant. I am here for you. It's not me, being this oppressive force. I'm here to help you. I'm here to stop whatever crime is being committed against you, to help you if your child's missing, to help you if someone that you love has wandered off that is dementia or something of those natures, and to also, try to build bridges in the community to have neighbors figure out their own problems without police intervention. And so I put into place a lieutenant who has my mentality of more of a college type environment. We really had a militaristic type environment where you couldn't ask questions and it was yes, sir, no, sir. And I thought, well, if you don't understand what I'm telling you to do and what I'm trying to train you on, and you don't feel like you can ask a question, then that's a problem. And so we have big open dialogues now, and the officers feel free to be able to have conversations. Again, the DEI training will be continuous, and we will be talking about, and not having me tell you what it's like to be a person of color, but to have someone come in and tell you what it's like, or to have family members come in and tell you, this is my reality, this is my experience, that my child is autistic and I'm afraid to call you because I don't know if you're going to shoot them if they have a knife. And so training on all of these types of things, and then working with the crisis response officers, if they're working, to have the clinician go to those calls. We're hoping to put a clinician in dispatch. So when families call in, they can say, my child is suffering from A, B, and C, or my husband or my wife, and they have a history of this, just to have that more education for the officers to have that information before they respond. We're also looking at what type of calls civilian type police could do. We're looking to move to a civilian traffic group that would go to non-injury accidents, those types of things, and then expanding on that to where an officer with a uniform and a gun wouldn't even be involved in that call if everyone there is safe and there's no danger that someone could be hurt. So we're looking at that. It's Denver has their STAR program. Ours is called the Right Response, and it's just getting started. The city is leading the path on that, but we will also still have our crisis response team. So I'm always looking I would love to have some of you all come and talk. You're an aspiration, an inspiration to me that you guys are powerful, because the future is yours, to come in and talk to my officers and let them know how you feel and have real conversations with them as well. Because I feel like I get it, but the officer on the street needs to get it too. And so I'm open to anything that you guys have suggestions for. We would love to incorporate.
Thanks, Chief Wilson. My name is Jason Murdoch. I also am a part of our student culture team with Mr. Maxey. I am the middle school dean of students. And I have a pretty long kind of layered question, but before I get into that, I like to backtrack a little bit and briefly touch on the de-escalation points when you were talking about tapping another officer out, and it's also okay for, in the moment of a heated argument to kind of step back to try to de-escalate it. I like to kind of point out, I think that would have been a fair shake that they should have gave George Floyd. Had they had that kind of system in place, that man may still be living today. So I really appreciate you bringing that topic up, because that's good to hear from many of us that kind of fear those situations of happening to not only our person, but our kids and our family and loved ones. So that was a great point. And then I wanted to tie in what you talked about with suspicious looking characters. This question actually, is around the topic of what a threat is. So I'll kind of jump into that and it'll kind of tie together as I go. Federal law justifies deadly force as when a reasonable person would consider the threat likely to cause death or serious bodily harm. So the description of threat is very vague, misused, and seemingly undefined per officer and sometimes per law enforcement agency. This misuse has led to the deadly force, and use of extreme force often resulted in death towards many, often people of color. The threat of interrogation, the threat of equality, and we're going back in history a little bit, the threat of Black success, the threat of being in the wrong area at the wrong time, the threat of defiance or disagreeing with an officer that they feel is doing their job, and at the same time, that person is feeling like they don't understand what's going on, so I'm asking questions. At times, that becomes a threat. The threat of losing, the threat of embarrassment, the threat of racist white wealthy influences demanding certain areas and community culturally look and remain the same. Does APD have a clear definition of what the threat is? And also, what trainings can be added, changed, or made more intensive? And you touched on some of these things a little bit, to reduce so many of America's law enforcement officers' perception of a wide range of threat that oftentimes as we don't begin with an alleged weapon or bodily harm. So I know that was long-winded, and feel free to kind of ask me to kind of backtrack or repeat some of that. But I think from a Black man's perspective, what makes me a threat? Could you answer that for us, please?
Well, for me, the fact that you're a Black man doesn't make a threat, right? So I think what it goes back to is the implicit bias that people have and the fear. And I mean, I'm trying to educate myself as much as I can so that I can, and I talk to the people that are way smarter than me about, what's happening. And I've heard people talk about just being a person of African-American descent, you're viewed as being stronger or larger, right, in some people's minds, and having that reaction. And so we have to call those things out. We have to say this exists. This isn't fake. This is real. And so check yourself on why you're responding in a certain way. And I think back to the beginning of this, why you all created your podcast, which was the death or the murder of George Floyd. I think absolutely that would have stopped that. And it's hard to watch. It's hard to watch as an officer. And I can tell you many of us were disgusted by what we saw. But we're not perfect. We have our own issues here. We have our own changes that we need to make here. So I think the threat is we do our best to train people on if you see a weapon, obviously, and we talk about the 21-foot rule and how fast someone can, these are the old things that we've trained on, how fast they can get to you with a knife. We never used to focus on retreating, right? The machismo part of law enforcement of, I said so do it. We got to change that. We got to change it. People have a right to ask us people have a right to be angry about our presence. People have a right to tape us and videotape us. And we have to check our emotions, even though we're human, and not react to those things and not have it become, like you said, embarrassment, or I said so, and my, it's kind of like the South Park, respect my authority, that ridiculousness, right? Like, no, we have authority, but you have authority too, as a resident and as a citizen. And so we have to respect one another. So we're trying to really get away from that, the us versus them, and really, how do we get through this safely, where we all go home, we all get a resolution to whatever has brought us together. And I think it's just going to be, more training, more realistic scenario-based training, where officers, we're bringing in actors that are going to be really escalated with our officers. And so they have that first family that's in crisis. And when they get on scene and everybody's screaming and yelling and running around and the officer's like, what's going on? We want to hopefully have some sort of training where they can say, okay, I've seen this before. I need to calm down, and not have that reaction of everybody do what I said right now, and try to take a step back and de-escalate, figure out, as long as there's no weapons being shown, as long as no one's coming at the officer, let's all take a breath, and figure out where's the issue, right? Because the screaming and the anger or whatever could be happening in that really volatile situation may not even be directed towards the officer. It could just be directed towards the situation that's happening. And so just a lot of communication and a lot of good supervision with our sergeants that are out there having these debriefings of how can we do this call better, realizing that we don't have all the answers, and then realizing that, it's our job to try and de-escalate now. There'll be times, and I knock on wood, and every night before I go to bed, I pray that we don't have another tragedy here in the city of Aurora. But it's our job to figure out how to do it safely for everyone involved, including the subject or including the suspect. And so that everybody goes home or ends up, if they have to be taken to jail, they go there safely and they go there with dignity. So I hope I answered your question.
You did. And ladies, I'm gonna go off script a little bit. Sorry, don't be too mad, Alana. I apologize. But I wanted to jump back real quick. Shouldn't that word, the threat, possibly be changed? Because if this policy was made back in the history when it was kind of to police and harass and do the things that it was historically towards Black people, that word, the threat, could have been could have been used to describe a certain particular genre of people. And then the word right after the threat, likely. What makes me likely to cause the death or serious harm? Is it because I'm bigger, because I'm stronger?
I think that's a great question, and one that I don't have the answer to right here and now, but I think it's a good conversation to have. And the threat is going to be what I'm going to be feel threatened by, what Officer B might be feel threatened by anybody else might be that's calling in a threat, that they feel threatened by someone in the community, what made them feel threatened. And so I think that's conversations that need to happen across the nation of why, just kind of like the suspicious person thing. Why are you seen as a threat just because of the color of the skin or your stature? And so they're not comfortable conversations, but I think we need to have them. So.
Thank you. Sorry, Alana. I apologize, ladies.
That's okay. And I know that you have to go in a second, Chief Wilson, but so you've been bringing up trainings this entire time, and we actually have a book called VH365. It's an educational entity whose purpose is to create cutting-edge resources that invite students, educators, and other readers to become critical thinkers, compassionate listeners, fact-based, respectful communicators, and action-oriented solutionists. This book has 40 chapters that start with our history in ancient Africa. Denver Public Schools is working to adopt this textbook for all of their schools, and knowing that an important first step in dismantling systems of oppression will require training, we would like to invite you to get a copy of VH365 and consider committing it to the professional development in your academy and ongoing police trainings.
Absolutely, I would love it. So, if you can get that information to me, I tried to jot it down. I could see just a little bit of it, but if you get that book to me, I will get it to our, there you go. I'll get it to my training staff, and they're very excited about the changes we've made. The training staff for a long time was just a lot of times were because we trained so much skills, right, and focused on how good you could shoot, how good you could, do arrest control, how good you could do those types of things. And now what we're looking for is people that can communicate, people that can recognize situations, and that's really the person we're looking for versus the the guy that can lift 2,000 pounds or something of that nature. So we'll get this book to the training academy, and we'll see what they would like to create as far as some sort of curriculum. And then I would invite you to come out and meet with my staff and talk about the book and what chapters you think are most important. Obviously, we have 26 weeks of training. We have so much time to do certain classes, but I would love for you to come out and talk about what's most important for you all and have a really good discussion with them, and we can set that up.
Thank you so much for that. And yeah, let's definitely be in communication about that, because I know all of us would love to do that. And thank you for putting the textbook, or considering putting the textbook in your police trainings. That also means a lot to us. But thank you for coming on here and talking to us. We appreciate you giving us and our audience your perspective and some insight into what APD is doing. We as students and members of the Black community want to feel safe with those whose job is protect and serve, instead of feeling that the police is against us. Instead of fearing that we may die if we come into contact with them, even when we are sleeping in our own bed, suffering from a mental health episode, falling asleep in our own car, minding our own business in our home or our grandmother's backyard with our cell phone, or even being arrested for a counterfeit $20 bill. We want to be safe. We hope that this conversation we've had today will help in moving us closer to that goal. We understand a change this big is not easy, but we know that it is more than possible, and it should never have been this way in the first place.
Agreed. Thank you so much, everyone, for having me. I'd love to come back sometime.
Of course. Thank you for coming on.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
On today's episode, we discussed the history of the police in this country, how they've affected the Black community, issues that still persist today, and how Black people are treated by police, and the possible solutions that need to be addressed in order to make change. Here's our call to action. We ask that you hold your police departments accountable for any disconnections, unaddressed problems, and opportunities for extreme growth, as even if you're not someone who's threatened by the police, at the end of the day, you could be making other citizens' experiences with the police better before something bad happens. Second, unbundle what tasks police now do and ask which of those tasks actually need a police response. A report of a gunfight? Yes. A person in a mental health crisis or an issue with a homeless person or a drug overdose? Mobile units of other professionals like social workers or mental health counselors should come to the scene. Not just the funding, but the responsibility for those issues should be taken from police and given to others more suited.
We want to thank our sponsors, Black History 365 Education, for creating this amazing textbook and supporting us in our advocacy for it in DPS. Urban Leadership Foundation of Colorado for putting in their time and resources in studying and supporting local activism, and their $14,000 donation. And Little Man Ice Cream for donating $10,000 to us for our curriculum and providing ice cream to our in-person students.
You can follow us on our social media, KJKP The Take, and email us at kjkpthetake@gmail.com. Make sure to also subscribe to our YouTube channel, No Justice, No Peace, The Take. Make sure you give us your feedback through our social media and tune into next week's episode.